Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian, and we are continuing our coverage of the presidential transition now that Donald Trump has been elected the 45th Chief Executive of the United States. And we're at Cowen & Company, a financial services house, and at their Washington office in Georgetown to talk to Roman Schweitzer, who is Cowen & Company's man in Washington. Roman, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Happy to do it, Vago. Nice to see you.
Obviously, the big question everybody is asking is, what does the Donald Trump administration mean for both defense spending? You've put a number of notes out on that. I want to start there and then also talk about the potential industrial ramifications of the election.
Sure. I think the Trump victory combined with the GOP retention of Congress was really the outsized impact that no one anticipated. Really, that is the most bullish case for defense spending overall. And really because now you have the leverage of having a united Republican government to potentially undo the Budget Control Act, use the budget reconciliation process to make adjustments, and really under most of the scenarios that envisioned a Clinton victory with a Democratic Senate and a Republican House, there would have had to be deal making. Really now the only governor on how much defense spending gets will be what the Republicans decide to do about debt deficit and their other fiscal priorities.
The plan that candidate Trump endorsed without much elaboration was the Heritage Foundation plan, which looked at about a $70 to $100 billion increase in defense spending on an annual basis. Is that likely to still be the template? What are some of the figures that folks are talking about in terms of how much upside there's going to be for defense, both in 2017 but also beyond?
I think 2017 is more a unique case. We'll have to see how that plays out. Obviously, the government's operating under a continuing resolution until December 9th. Given the atmospherics in Washington right now, it'll be a big question to see whether Democrats want to not negotiate and play scorched earth. If they decide to do that, I think the Republicans would be fine to punt the CR into next year when Democrats will have little leverage and they'll have more free rein to make a significant number of policy adjustments. I think probably the thing that's in everyone's best interest, including the Pentagon's, is to get the 17 appropriations work done by the end of December, get that in place, and sort of the perception is that everyone starts with a fresh start moving forward. Looking out 18 through 21, obviously the Heritage Plan that candidate Trump discussed in Philly a few weeks ago or over a month ago, those budget numbers going back to sort of the pre-BCA, Bob Gates type budgets, I think would be very difficult to do in this fiscal environment. Given all of the other things that the GOP has on its plate, ACA repeal, corporate tax reform or tax reform in general, it's going to be infrastructure spending. There's just going to be a clash of priorities. I think defense is one of those priorities, probably not the highest. And at the end of the day, the House Freedom Caucus and certainly more fiscally conservative members of Congress are going to want to see deficit reduction and debt reduction. That will remain a key priority. So how all these things blend together over the course of the next 6 months is going to be very interesting to see.
There are those, obviously, we hit the debt ceiling in March. Government can do some measures to push that further out. It's unclear whether or not the administration has an incentive to try to push it out at this point, given that it's not handing off to a Democratic administration, it's handing off to a Republican administration at this point. How significant an issue do you think is debt really going to be, given that it was not even an issue in the entire presidential campaign? I mean, if you look at it, it doesn't appear that debt was a motivating factor. If it was, for example, that would have impeded Trump's chances, in part because, of concerns that the fundamental plan is unaffordable. If you don't want to touch entitlements, you want to give tax cuts, but at the same time increase defense spending and infrastructure spending.
Right. I think debt ceiling was really the point of leverage for the House Republicans to use if the Senate flipped, if Hillary Clinton had won. I think it's kind of off the table now. I think a debt ceiling will be rolled into this larger vision of the Paul Ryan budget and how they treat all these other spending elements. And really, I can't imagine that a Republican Congress would force a Republican president into a weird scenario on debt, even as much as he likes to use it.
Let me take you to the issue of what may be in the defense plan. If you look at the Heritage Plan is very much about more stuff. It makes great bumper stickers. I'm looking for 350 ships. I'm looking for X numbers of airplanes. And it's also very manpower intensive. If you looked at what the Clinton team was looking at, it was very much a continuation of a lot of the initiatives that this administration started: third offset, innovation focus. What should we expect to see from an industrial plan coming from the Trump administration? Is it going to be more numerical and stuff oriented, or is there going to be that focus on leveraging technology, a whole bunch of things that we've been seeing over the past 8 years from this administration?
Right. Well, first off, I think you're right to point out it is just a lot more stuff in terms of force structure for the Army and Marine Corps. The Heritage Plan, I think, was 346 ships, which is still a significant increase. And so I think moving forward, the real limiter, again, will be budget. For my purposes, what I've done is kind of looked at the current FYDP that the Pentagon has been planning to. It's above the BCA cap. So I think that's a useful mechanism to kind of see what the Pentagon wants between fiscal 18 and 21 over the next 4 years. And really, I think that's the going in position for Republicans. It nets out to about $105 billion over those 4 years. So $25 billion a year gets you what the Pentagon says it currently wants. I think that's my base case, right? Because I think at least the Republicans can say this is the bare minimum of what DOD says it needs. And then somewhere in between that is more OCO. Senator John McCain has talked about $50 billion a year, and then you kind of ratchet up to the Trump plan, which, $75 to $100 billion a year. So, I think somewhere within that range, I'm comfortable. I think that, $25 billion a year is probably doable within all of the other fiscal priorities. And that still nets out to high single-digit growth annually for DOD, and within the top line. I think the other issue is what are the new initiatives? When you look at that Heritage Plan, probably the newest idea, and also a perennial Republican favorite, not a Russian favorite, is missile defense. And so you could see an East Coast missile defense site. You could see various new missile defense programs kind of take shape. Certainly, Jeff Sessions, potentially Secretary of Defense, has a strong inclination towards missile defense programs, and really that could be a key issue for him moving forward. So a lot of that budget, would be soaked up or dedicated to manpower, right? If you're going to increase the size of the Army and Marine Corps significantly, personnel costs associated with that. So it's all not net, new projects.
And obviously Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama, obviously important place for missiles and rockets for the Army, going back to the end of World War II. What's the temperature on how the administration is likely to work with and regard defense contractors? There's been some language that's been used about government contractors that are getting more than their fair share, whatever. There were some of those questions obviously on both sides during the campaign, as part of this anti-establishment tenor and tone we had. What does that potentially mean for defense contractors?
I kind of take a different view. I mean, obviously the people matter. President Trump is not going to negotiate the next LRIP-I for the JSF. Neither is Secretary of Defense Sessions. So really, who takes those senior jobs in AT&L and at the service acquisition executive level, that will be a good indicator of how they're going to kind of run the operations. Certainly, the President and Secretary can kind of set the tone. But, the thing I would remind people is, we've had better buying power for, coming on 8 years now. And I think there's a view in industry, certainly, that, nothing could be worse than that. So, there's sort of a contrarian view that while the terms may be tough, they may be more fair, and they certainly can't be as bad as they have been. So I think it's an open question, and it's certainly a valid one. But, I think a lot of the companies have conditioned themselves to operate in this environment, and it's they continue to evolve as DOD continues to get smarter. So.
And last question: how do you think the Goldwater-Nichols reforms, that's obviously been a priority for both Chairman Thornberry, Adam Smith, as well as on the Senate side with Jack Reed and obviously Chairman McCain. Chairman McCain survived his toughest re-election race, so he is returning. What do you think? What is the nature of that discussion going to look like now, when it's an entirely Republican slate that's controlling the discussion?
Right. I think the Trump-McCain relationship is a fascinating one. And really, this is Chairman McCain's dream opportunity to really make the kinds of reforms that he has talked about, and that also could be a bellwether for industry or a worry area for some of those programs that have been in his crosshairs over the years.
Because he's been a lot tougher on industry than the Pentagon has been, right? So some of McCain's guys will say that the Pentagon was too permissive on industry at a time when the industry was looking at what was going on as being tough.
Correct. And so I think it'll be interesting to see, whether the president-elect, campaigning is one thing, but governing is another. And certainly, Senator John McCain has spent his entire career in defense, and his staff. Obviously, if you look at the Defense Authorization Bill, he's got some pretty important changes that he thinks he'd like to see done. And certainly, if you had someone, like a colleague like Jeff Sessions go over there, I would think there would be a high degree of collaboration. Certainly not to downplay the role that the House would have, because certainly Chairman Thornberry is also very well regarded. So really, it is a again, like budget, like many of these things, it is a massive opportunity to kind of redo or undo or correct some things that the Republicans on the Armed Services Committees haven't been able to do over the last 8 years.
Stocks, how have they been responding in the sector?
They've responded very well over the past few days. I think a lot of that is people recognizing that this Trump congressional scenario was the most bullish of bullish cases. And I worry over the weeks and months, though, that there is a budgetary reality, and there are larger Republican priorities, and how those get intertwined and hashed out will really depend on what the outlook for defense looks like over the course of the year.
But if the top lines are going up, right, the companies have been able to increase stock prices by buybacks and a lot of, just putting out just enormous dividends. And there was a concern that that was an unsustainable scenario that the industry was getting into. But now if you're looking at some top line relief, do you expect that trend to continue in the industry, where the buybacks continue, the dividends continue, and the stock prices just keep climbing?
It's unclear at this point what company managements will do as that, but clearly the one big issue is that even under the worst case, there was these companies were returning to growth, to top line growth. The combination of both the Budget Control Act and starting to inflect upward, albeit at a modest 2.5%, and then really a pretty solid couple of years of foreign military sales, right? So you had two halves of the equation just kind of cranking along. Looking forward, if you're talking about 5 to 8% growth in the defense budget, and we haven't even talked about OCO, that's a heck of a lot better than GDP. So that sector should be growing at a much higher percentage than the rest of the economy, and that makes those companies attractive.
Let's talk about OCO. Go.
Well, no. Clearly, I think the longer term. What is Commander-in-Chief Trump? What is his vision for Syria? Obviously, Iraq, Afghanistan. Neither candidate really talked about. Right now we're at the $59 billion level. The administration just submitted a supplemental request, $11 billion. Half of that's for DoD, so we're at the $65 billion level. I really think under almost any circumstance, absent a complete and total withdrawal from U.S. forces around the world, you're going to be north of $50 billion for the next couple of years. And I think that's also a factor that people ought to think about moving forward, and they'll be looking for answers. A lot of our allies around the world, obviously, trying to sort through this in Europe and the Middle East and Asia. And I think that will also be, aside from the Republican sort of internal negotiations about budget priorities, sort of the external view about, President-elect Trump's position on NATO and our Middle East policy, and even our positions with China and the Philippines and others will be the other key issue.
Do you think there are some folks in the Pentagon? Candidate Trump was very clear that he did not regard Russia as a threat. Variety of reasons for that. There are some who say that it was because of the close advisors that are around him, and others that say that the Russians were helping him in the campaign, and that may indicate something. But ultimately, it's a very different view of the threat about Russia than almost everybody else has had, including the intelligence communities, including our allies. And there are even some in the Pentagon that are saying, hey, you know what? We're not really sure whether or not Russia is going to stay as one of the highest level threat. If there's a change in the threat determination on Russia, How does that change the defense picture from your standpoint?
Right. A couple of things. I mean, I would also submit that there are Republicans in Congress who have a much dimmer view of Russia. So that's probably going to be a bigger debate. But I think the one thing that sort of Russia's behavior over the last 18 months to 2 years has shown is that it can become a threat at any time of its choosing. So completely taking the eye off and not preparing and not doing some of the things that we're currently doing in Europe under the reassurance initiative and preparing allies and things like that. That stuff may press forward because it may, in 2 to 4 years, we don't know how that temperature changes. So that's certainly a valid issue. But I think when President Trump sits down with the Pentagon and hears their worst fears and speaks to his counterparts in Congress, folks who have done this for a long time, he may have a more sobering view of his potential friend in Russia. And I think the bottom line assumption is that I think there's a worry that while you can have a good and fair relationship with Russia, we shouldn't delude ourselves or be hoodwinked. And so I think that'll be interesting to see how that relationship matures. And clearly, I think people would say that Russia has to demonstrate a change in attitude as opposed to just talk about it. And that we'll have to see how that evolves, particularly in Syria.
Roman, thanks very much for joining us.
Absolutely. Happy to do it, Vago.